I'm going to start us. I want you to take some deep breaths and maybe close your eyes. And I want you to think about a place where you live or something around where you live that is beautiful or brings you joy, whether it's plants or animals or the stars in the sky or geological formations. What is it about that place? For me, I just love the stars out here. And God created all of that. But for thousands of years, the Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders people have cared for it. And they have so much knowledge about the places where we live. And so I want to acknowledge those custodians of the land, where you are and where we are. And we pay our respects to their elders that have for a long time cared for the land and learned about the land and know it, both past, present, and those that are learning about it now.
Now, before we get into looking at this book, The Field Guide to Christian Nonviolence, I want to just run a 10-minute talk about Christian nonviolence to give some of the background, some of the history of this tradition. And then from there, we'll launch into talking about a field guide for Christian nonviolence. This speaker is an Anabaptist from Virginia who owns a gardening business. He's going to give us this presentation.
Jesus of Nazareth calls all Christians to love their enemies. And this means Christians, in following Jesus, must reject violence, coercion, and war. People have called this position pacifism, nonviolence, non-resistance, or enemy love. Jesus taught many things that fly in the face of our natural inclinations. He brought an upside-down kingdom with a value system that is diametrically opposed to the world's way of doing things. One of his most countercultural teachings is his command to love your enemies. While many Christian traditions in history have taught that it is permissible to use lethal force in certain situations, this is something that is highly problematic. It's led to the justification of horrific acts throughout history, such as the Crusades and the use of nuclear weapons on civilians. The human cost of violence conducted by people bearing the name of Christ is inconsistent with Jesus himself. But what about the just war theory, you might ask? Well, there's not one verse in the entire biblical canon that posits just war theory. In fact, Augustine and Aquinas were the first Christians to begin to develop this theory many years after Christ and his apostles delivered us the faith. Now, there is holy war in the Old Testament, but Israel certainly did not follow the constraints of just war theory. The Bible does not say that Christians can participate in killing based on the conditions of the just war theory, which posit that war must be conducted by the government, be for a just cause, be more likely to be successful than not, be the last resort, and use sufficient force and controlled violence, killing soldiers, not civilians. You just can't find this in the Bible. If we assume that love your enemies is a central and non-optional command of Jesus, then in order to justify a just war position, theorists will need to demonstrate that it is possible to love someone and kill them simultaneously. Now, it is possible to kill one's enemy out of love for his neighbor, but Jesus calls us to love more than our neighbor, but also our enemy. Agape love, altruistic love toward an image bearer of God, seeks the well-being of that person. Killing that person does not contribute to their well-being, either in this life, since it ends it, or in the next life, since it cuts off their opportunity to repent. Christian love is much more than just an inward disposition that does not affect how one acts toward another. Simply put, when Jesus said, "Love your enemies," he probably meant don't kill them. In Matthew 5:39, Jesus said, "Do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also." Now, the Greek word for resist is a military term in classical Greek, also used by Thucydides. Jesus also told the Roman governor Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight." Unlike every other nation, the political institution that Jesus brought to earth does not use coercion to enforce its moral ideal. Furthermore, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Peter took up the sword to defend the most innocent person on the planet, with the most just act of self-defense imaginable, Jesus said, "Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword." And then he went on to heal the person Peter had injured. Finally, the most powerful testimony that Jesus left about nonviolence was the example he laid down for us through his suffering and death. Now, it is certainly true that the primary reason Jesus died on the cross was to provide atonement for our sins. However, 1 Peter 2:21 makes it clear that Jesus' death was also exemplary by stating that Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps. See, as Isaiah foretold, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. In the same passage where Peter says that Jesus' behavior on Golgotha is our supreme example, he states, "When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly." This posture toward one's enemies is the exact opposite of our natural disposition. But this is precisely how the powers of darkness are defeated. Paul states in Colossians that having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. This is how evil will always be defeated. We are citizens of the nation of Jesus and therefore vanquish darkness his way, not by yielding to the subhuman solutions offered by Babylon. In Romans 12, Paul echoes the Sermon on the Mount by saying, "Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves." The life and example of Jesus, followed by the apostles, gives us a clear and unequivocal example to follow. However, we also have the testimony of the early church and its consistent pacifist position in the centuries before the Emperor Constantine came on the scene. This matters because these early church fathers were the direct theological descendants of the apostles, and thus were more likely to correctly understand their teachings than we are. Let's start with Tertullian. He said, "The Christian does not hurt, even his enemy. Only without the sword can the Christian wage war. The Lord has abolished the sword. No one gives the name of sheep to those who fall in battle with arms in hand, or those who are killed when repelling force with force. Rather, it is given only to those who are slain, yielding themselves up in their own place of duty and with patience, rather than fighting in self-defense." But now inquiry is being made concerning these issues. First, can any believer enlist in the military? Second, can any soldier, even those of the rank and file or lesser grades, who neither engage in pagan sacrifices nor capital punishment, be admitted into the church? No, on both counts. Now, this quote is important because many people claim that the reason Christians were discouraged from participating in the military in the early church is because of the pagan rituals, which is simply not the case. Soldiers were not always told to leave the army, but were forbidden from killing while enlisted. Tertullian also said, "Christ, in disarming Peter, disarmed every soldier." Justin Martyr, "We ourselves were well conversant with war, murder, and everything evil. But all of us throughout the whole wide earth have traded in our weapons of war. We have exchanged our swords for plowshares, our spears for farm tools." Clement of Alexandria, "The church is an army of peace, which sheds no blood." Hippolytus, a soldier of the civil authority, must be taught not to kill men, and to refuse to do so if he is commanded, and to refuse to take an oath. If he is unwilling to comply, he must be rejected for baptism. Origen, we do not go forth as soldiers with the emperor, even if he demands this. Cyprian, the hand must not be spotted with sword and blood, not after the Eucharist is carried in it. Finally, the First Council of Nicaea in AD 325, Canon 12, forbids Christian soldiers from returning to the military. So what happened? Why did all of this change? One of the major turning points in Christian history was the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine. As the story goes, Constantine was a ruler on a quest to secure the Roman throne for himself. Before his final battle with rival Maxentius, he reportedly had a vision in which he saw with his own eyes the trophy of a cross of light in the heavens above the sun, and bearing the inscription, "In hoc signo vinces," "In this you shall conquer." Constantine thus emblazoned a Christian symbol on his soldier's shield and used it as his banner as they slaughtered enemy soldiers. The faith has never been the same since. Constantine began the fusing of church and state, cross and violence, which is a distorted and utterly erroneous representation of who Jesus is and what the cross stood for, which is laying down one's life for one's enemies. Subsequently, the Emperor Theodosius sealed the deal by making Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Christian empires that followed in this vein continued to kill, steal, and destroy, creating untold suffering and devastation throughout the world. God is love. God revealed his love decisively through dying for his enemies on a Roman cross 2,000 years ago. May we faithfully follow the example and teachings of the slaughtered Lamb as we conquer evil and vanquish darkness his way. May we turn from the path of violence and onto the way of the Prince of Peace.
So the book that we were suggesting that people read is A Field Guide to Christian Nonviolence. And it's a book that lists some of the key thinkers, activists, and movements for the gospel of peace. Dave Kramer is a professor at Associated Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart, and a number of us took a course with him on Christian nationalism earlier this year. And Miles Wernz is at Abilene Christian College, I think in Texas. The two of them went to Baylor University in Texas and got to know each other, and then ended up writing this book. And then here's some about the book. Christian nonviolence is not a settled position, but a vibrant and living tradition that includes mystics, feminists, liberation theologians, civil rights activists, Niebuhrian realists, and more. This book offers a concise introduction to the variety of recent movements within the broad stream of Christian nonviolence. There have been a number of books like this over the years that Herald Press and other Anabaptist and peace book publishers have put out that have talked about people in the different generations that have led peacemaking efforts going on. This one in particular talks about people like Howard Thurman and his influence. And I would encourage you, if you don't know much about Howard Thurman, to look him up online. There are a number of good videos and have talks from him. He was one who was very much influenced by Gandhi. Back in the, I think in the 1920s, he went and visited Gandhi, then came back and had a real influence on many of the civil rights leaders in the US, including Martin Luther King Jr. Martin Luther King, it is said, carried one of Howard Thurman's books with him as he traveled around and worked in the civil rights work. Howard Thurman has been one of those people who's had a real influence on me and has been a real mentor. You don't hear a lot about him because he wasn't an upfront activist that was out there leading things, but he was the mentor that trained and was the spiritual support for many of the other civil rights leaders over the years, people like John Lewis and Martin Luther King and others. When Martin Luther King was stabbed at a book signing one time, it was Howard Thurman who went and ministered to him as he was in the hospital. So there are a number of really good videos online about some of the people that are talked about in this book. It says, since the 1980s, there has been an explosion of writings on Christian nonviolence, yet no work exists that makes sense of this plurality or to orient newcomers to the resources available to think faithfully and critically through what it means to be a proponent of Christian nonviolence. When I picked up this book and read it, it reminded me of books that I read back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that did the same kind of thing. It talked about some of the leaders of peacemaking movements at that time. And what these two authors have done is they've brought it more up to date into the 2000s. But there are other books that trace some of the early 20th century peacemakers. This book provides such an introduction for professors, students, scholars, and lay readers. The authors explore the myriad biblical, theological, and practical dimensions of Christian nonviolence as represented by a variety of 20th and 21st century thinkers and movements, including previously underrepresented voices. They invite readers to explore the tradition and to discover how they might live out the gospel in our modern world. And then this is just the contents of the book. They go through a number of traditions of Christian nonviolence and introduce you to a number of the key thinkers and writers and leaders. And this is just one review from somebody from Sojourners saying that Christian nonviolence is not a singular thing or a fixed set of beliefs and practices. As Kramer and Wernz show through careful comparative work, Christian nonviolence is a family of ideas with the same concoction of shared genes, grafted on new branches, and fierce internal disagreements that we expect of any family. The issues change for us over the years, and what we need to be applying nonviolence to. One of the things that you'll notice next week as you look at the mailing, I'm going to have a lot in about different sexuality issues. Right-wing Christians in the States have been taking on homosexuality and transgender people. And there have been a lot of articles recently coming out about that. So in next week's mailing, I'll have a number of articles and presenting different sides, because it's not a settled issue, but it's one that has really taken form over the last couple of years as some of the, particularly in the States, some of the Republicans have become more and more conservative. They've gone after some of the groups like homosexuals and transgenders and different groups like that.
So, have any of you watched the video of these two gentlemen?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Okay.
I've read the book.
Oh, good.
Good. So what comments or questions do you have, or discussions do you want to get into? Matt Anslow is supposed to be joining us and talking about Love Makes a Way as an example of Christian nonviolence today. I just texted him. I don't know, well, we spoke to him the other day and he was going to be on, so I don't know where he is. But in the meantime, what are the issues that were raised for you in reading this book?
Or that you even think about when you think about Christian nonviolence.
So we'll open it up for discussion at this point.
Would I just say about the book that it's the best survey on the issue that I've seen recently. It picks up issues in the last couple of chapters that are relatively new, and extends the discussion into sexual and gender-based violence in a way that sort of begins to open up the connections. I just want to say that, and it's relative. Well, it's hard to tell because I've read a lot of in this space, but my reaction is that even people without a really major involvement in reading theology, that this is an accessible book if you stay with it, I think.
I think one of the things that hit me when I was watching the video was he was talking about slow violence, how it kind of builds, and that can be against the environment or against like sexual violence or that kind of thing. It's not once and that kind of powerful thing, but this slow buildup of violence against other people.
The other issue that it did raise for me that's causing me considerable thought is the implications of this for responding to the environmental crisis that we face, thinking about the issues involved for people in taking action on that. I think that for me, as I think about the world that I'm going to be leaving my grandkids, is a major and troubling concern.
Especially if you're in South Australia. South Australia, for the news,
Yes.
just made some terrible rulings against doing demonstrations and nonviolent action kind of things.
So I just want to register
You mean
that.
following the UK? Sorry.
It does strike me that the use of the word violence has changed over my intellectual life in the last 30 years. So there is a broader understanding that all sorts of things can be violent apart from punching someone in the face or pulling a gun on them. Is that, would you say that's true, or did I just miss something earlier on in my reading? Are we thinking about psychological violence and violence to the land in ways that we wouldn't have used the term violence 30 years ago?
No, I think you're right, and that's part of the value of this book. It's extended that idea of what violence is. Doing damage in all kinds of ways is violence, and I think in years past we've had a very limited definition of what violence is.
Some of the groups that we've worked with have said calling it nonviolence is, it still talks about violence. And so we really need another word rather than nonviolence, but that's what we're stuck with at present. I think it was Miles who said that it's character building, it's character things, and that it comes out of that rather than just this idea that we're nonviolent. It's our whole being. Because I know when we've worked with nonviolent groups, supposedly doing peace work, sometimes they're very violent to each other. And so that building a whole character that is working at peace, working at peacemaking, working at loving your enemy.
Yeah, it's not just tactic, it's a way of life.
Yeah.
And there are a number of videos that we've watched in preparation for today that talk about that's really when we're talking about peacemaking and shalom and nonviolence, we're talking about a way of life and not just specific tactics.
Yeah, it made me think it's like on the transformation spectrum, like it's not a static thing. So that quote about it being like a family, the family dynamics, families change over time. You get people entering the family, leaving the family, for whatever reasons. It's not a family, even a family is not a static thing. So I think it's like a progress and a process. So I know personally, I would testify that it has been for me, over the last 20 years as I learn more about it from great sources like, are featured here on Table Fellowship, but also, through the transformation that, personal relationship with the Prince of Peace, as well as the in-community relationships. So there's certainly a lot of dynamics and angles and facets there.
So welcome, Matt. What we've done so far is we did a video explaining a little bit about Christian nonviolence and talking about it as a way of life. And we did a little bit of an introduction to this book. So what we've invited you to share with us about is Love Makes a Way as a specific example of Christian nonviolence. And for those who don't know, Well, I'll let you explain what Love Makes a Way is, and turn it over to you at this point.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Sorry I'm late. I was just saying to Mark on the phone, we moved recently, and we were just setting up the kids' play equipment, and I thought it was probably closer to 3 o'clock rather than 4:30, so I did not nail the time. Good to be with you all. For those I've met, hello. For those I've not met, also hello, and nice to be with you and to be connected. So I'm sorry that I wasn't here earlier for the discussion. So if anything I say is a bit out of context or out of whack, just feel free to give me a jab and let me know. Let me share non-violently, yeah, like a little, just a finger poke, you know, don't swing at me or anything. Okay, so sorry, this slideshow was for something else, but look, I guess I don't want to waste anyone's time by explaining things that you might already know. Just a bit of a show of hands. Who has heard of Love Makes Way before? Okay, and this is new, you've not ever come across this before? Okay, a few. Oh, that's good. So for those who have heard of it, bear with. Yeah. So everyone can see those slides okay?
Yes.
Great. Look, Love Makes a Way was something that started formally, or, you know, officially or whatever, in March of 2014, but there was a lot of planning that went on for about 12 months before that. Let me tell the story briefly. Some of you may remember this poster. About 10 years ago was making the rounds. It was a government poster. It found its way all over Southeast Asia on billboards and that kind of thing. And it was the government's way of letting people who were in transit countries such as Malaysia or Indonesia, letting them know that there was no way that they would be able to get to Australia as refugees. So especially if they came by boat, that was, you know, especially the case, they had to come by the so-called proper channels, whatever that might mean, through the UNHCR process, things like that. But if you came by boat, there is no way that you would be able to make Australia home. And this accompanied a kind of, look, I'm sure that most of us are familiar with this pretty well, a period of Australian history that was deeply xenophobic, that was deeply antagonistic towards people who were simply seeking safety, often from places where Australia was in conflict, places like Afghanistan, for example. These are the kind of things that the Australian government, and not just the coalition government from 2013 onwards, but governments from both sides of politics in Australia have engaged in at different times. So we have engaged, obviously, in indefinite detention, in temporary protection visas. That is, we've not offered permanent protection to people who have especially come by a maritime means, by boat. We've only ever offered them, or we've generally only offered them, temporary protection visas at various points. At different times, there's been suspension of processing. We've just basically said we're not going to process people from certain places, and Australia has done that. For example, over the last 10 years, people from Afghanistan, it just said we're not going to process them. People from Sri Lanka, from Syria, at various points just said, well, people from those countries, they're not even going to be processed at all. We've engaged at various times in refoulement, which is a legal term for handing people back to their governments. And often those people have, as we found out later, have been tortured and sometimes murdered. We've engaged in a process of fast track assessments. That is, at various points, we have, the most egregious example of this was probably close to 10 years ago, where their boats were intercepted and they'd be taken onto the Navy vessel and they'd be sat in a room with someone who didn't speak their language, and they'd be asked about 4 questions, and that would be their assessment. So we've basically not done a proper job of assessing people. And these are people who are in traumatic situations. And then in various ways, we've removed legal safeguards, and I won't bother to go into the details. But you know the situation, right? Australia's regime of dealing with people who are seeking asylum and who have arrived by boat and then when those people get to detention centres, our detention regime has been deeply cruel and I would suggest immoral. There's a few quotes, one from a Senate inquiry and then one from the Australian Refugee Task Force, which was the sort of task force set up by the National Council of Churches. Indications of how bad that system was and is and remains. And this was our kind of response. On the 21st of March of 2014, there were a group of 9 of us plus our lovely photographer who entered the office of then Immigration Minister Scott Morrison. And we told his staff that we were going to stay there and we were going to pray. And we weren't going to leave until the minister made some public statements to the effect that they would release all children and their families from detention. At the time, there were 1,138 people under the age of 18 in our detention system, both offshore and onshore. And so we wanted him to make a public statement that he would be doing that. Now, obviously, that didn't happen. Rather, the police arrived and we were removed. And of the 9 of us, 5 were arrested and taken to Miranda Local Area Command. In the midst of this, the story of what we had done hit social media first and blew up, and then it hit the mainstream media not long after that. So that day I was our media representative and I took many interviews for radio and for written articles and that kind of thing, as well as the sort of blow up on social media that happened. And now it was a really interesting kind of thing. We kind of expected that we might split the population, including the church, down the middle. Some people would love what we did, some people hate what we did. In fact, at least from what we could see, certainly within the church, it was far more positive than that, which we weren't expecting. And what ended up happening was that people started to want to know how they could get involved. And we didn't necessarily have a plan for an ongoing kind of campaign or movement. We had planned this action as a one-off action, but the amount of people who wanted to be involved meant that we started doing more actions. Here's one. This was our 3rd action. And there were 2 on the same day in the offices of then Prime Minister Tony Abbott and then opposition leader Bill Shorten in obviously Sydney and Melbourne. Deeply ecumenical, as you might be able to tell from the pictures. I mean, the 2 men in top right and bottom left are both Uniting Church folks. Top right there is he was the then moderator of the Uniting Church, Brian Brown. And in the bottom left, you have former president of the National Assembly of the Uniting Church, Alistair McRae. But in those rooms, you've got, in the top left in Sydney, we've got an MCC minister, Uniting Church ministers, a Catholic priest, a Sydney Anglican priest, a Baptist, another Baptist come Uniting Church person, and then, Sydney Anglican leader from Sydney University. And then in the bottom right, Vineyard, there's a Catholic nun there, Churches of Christ, Uniting Church, Baptist. It's all over the place. And as we'd find out later, not too long later, Anabaptists would probably punch above their weight, again, non-violently, in terms of being involved with Love Makes a Way. Here was an action from Parliament House. This was more than a year later. We had, there was this kind of interesting confluence of events on this date. This was both World Refugee Day. It was also 10 years to the day that John Howard had agreed to release everyone from the detention centres under what was called the Pacific Solution. So we converged on Parliament House that day, and we all sort of had these T-shirts on, and we all managed to get through security somehow. And you can't hear it because the sound is off, but we're all singing a song. Mark and Mary, were you at that? I can't remember.
I was there with our 2 grandchildren, and Mariah was part of it. Mariah was
I can see Mariah. Yeah, she was doing the sort of security detail, like with all the.
Mary and our grandson just
went
in there.
on the
Yeah, right.
side. Yeah.
So there's a few people there from the Anabaptist Network. I mean, Mariah, Dave Andrews is pretty obvious there. If you know Dave, he's right
Yep.
at the bottom.
Yep.
Yeah. So
here's Mary and,
I'm
Noah.
in the black and white dress.
yeah, that's right. Look, it was the worst kept secret in history, I think. We had some parliamentarians who we tipped off about it, and they were standing ready in the balcony. If you know Parliament House, you know the balcony above the foyer. And so there was this sense of like something is about to happen. What is about to happen? And then this is what happened. So look, everyone was eventually removed. Look, these are all the actions. Why did we do any of this? Here's a few more things that we did. I'll just quickly go over them. Oh yeah, we did this. This was in 2016. If people remember when the Nauru files were released, they were over 2,000 leaked documents from the Nauru detention center, which had detailed, many of which detailed some pretty awful instances of abuse and self-harm and often sort of sexual. I worked with Kylie Beach. Some of you may know Kylie, who was at the time working for Eternity, and she was a Hillsong person as well. And we agreed that we needed to respond in some way to the Nauru files. And we thought it'd be good just to host public vigils at parliamentarians' offices around Sydney, because we're both from Sydney. Or at the time I was, I'm not anymore. So we thought if we could do like half the electorates in Sydney, that'd be amazing. There's about 28 or 29 electorates in Sydney. So if we could do 14 or so, I mean, that'd be great. And we started to plan and release the details of these. And then more and more people said, I'd love to run one in my electorate. And in the end, we ran 56 of them in a week, or in five days, or a week, which was, I think, the busiest week of my life, and managing all those. But again, a massive media presence as a result of this. And then we also did this. We held public readings of those same files in five different cities around the five capital cities around Australia. Again, massive media throughout the life of Love Makes a Way during sort of the peak of its activity, and that's probably 2014 to early 2017 or so. Just a massive opportunity to be able to talk about justice for refugees from the perspective of from a Christian perspective, interested in peacemaking and reconciliation and that kind of thing. What effect did it have? We saw a pretty significant shift in Australian attitudes to people in detention. So when we started, the polls seemed to suggest that about a third of Australians wanted to see people released from detention, and 2/3 were happy with the government's approach. But by 2016, that had shifted dramatically. Now, that is not just because of what Love Makes a Way did, and I'll explain this in a moment, but Love Makes a Way played a part in a larger refugee movement in Australia, and that movement was responsible for this change, not Love Makes a Way, certainly not in and of itself. We ran trainings all over the country. This was probably one of the things that kept me most busy during these years, running training events around the country. And basically everyone, I mean, Mark and Mary were exceptions because we trusted them to do the right thing, but the vast majority of people who engaged in actions with Love Makes a Way over those years had to participate in training first. And that number ended up being, we had 300 people who took part in arrestable actions. So not the vigils that were not arrestable. We had 300 people who risked arrest over probably a 2.5-year period. And 250 of those people were in fact arrested as part of those actions. This is some of the philosophy that undergirded what we did. I won't explain all that, just to say, obviously, nonviolence featured significantly. Those of us who were at the helm of Love Makes a Way were either Anabaptist or deeply influenced by Anabaptist voices in a variety of ways, certainly interested in peacemaking and reconciliation and that kind of thing. Love Makes a Way used this. This was one of our analytical tools for thinking about activism. And this comes from Bill Moyer, who was a community organizer from the United States, and he developed these sort of analytical tools that we picked up. This one here is what he calls the 4 roles of activism. And it suggests that for there to be successful social movements, you need each of these 4 roles. Part of what those of us who who planned that first action, and I'll name those people, by the way. There were three of us who sort of got the ball rolling and did the planning for that first action. It was me, Justin Whalen, who some of you know, and Joshua Doughton, who some of you know. We started meeting in very late, as in almost Christmas 2012, to talk about how we could respond. What that first action was the fruit of our planning. And this was one of the tools that we used because we thought to ourselves, and we thought to ourselves that one of the things that's missing in the refugee movement is that rebel role. Rebel is a bit of a cringy way to put it, maybe, but that role of dramatizing the issue, and that's using the language of Martin Luther King Jr., who talked about nonviolent direct action as dramatizing the issue, making it so that people can't ignore it, making it so that it comes to the surface, those hidden tensions underneath come to the surface. Not that they were that hidden in Australia with refugees at the time, but it comes to the surface and people are forced to confront it and deal with it. And they have to take a stand, even if it's against you, right? But they're forced to sort of work out what they think. And so the rebel played that role, and there was no one really doing that in the refugee area. There was plenty of it happening in like climate change, for example, not so much in this area. So we decided that because of our history and our sort of skills that we had, we could fill that role and do it in a really interesting way, because certainly the mainstream media would not have expected Christians who, you know, obviously we all vote liberal and we're all deeply conservative and all that. You know, I mean, that's how we're perceived, right? The media did not really expect Christians to be the ones to take up that rebel role. And that kind of disorientation that we were able to create was really helpful and really effective, especially early on. And then you've got this is all very complicated, but Moya talks about the fact that there are sort of 8 stages of any successful social movement. And we determined that we were probably in about stage 3. So there'd been business as usual. The government was sort of doing its thing, and, you know, people weren't necessarily engaged, you know, in maybe the 10 or 15 years before all this. And then the normal channels fail. We saw sort of events in Australia that demonstrated the fact that normal channels had failed. Like Tampa was a really great example of that. The death of Reza Barati was probably, that was probably later actually. But then you have this stage where the conditions ripen, where that's kind of where we wanted to drive things. We had an idea of where we wanted to push the refugee movement and the refugee, you know, issue in Australia. And so we sort of played that dramatic role, hoping that we could do that. And that's why, by the way, Love Makes Way eventually did come to an end in terms of, I mean, it still kind of exists, but it's basically sleeping. We basically got to a point where we went, I think we're done. Like, I don't think we need to do what we've been doing. Some people have disagreed with that. They sort of think you just need, you know, that kind of non-violent direct action all the time. And that may be true to a certain extent, but we didn't think we needed to continue to exist in the same way. So we basically closed Love Makes a Way it was a company at one point, because we were able to take donations, which was amazing. We had friends who helped us set that up. But we feel like we were able to help the refugee movement in Australia push into the takeoff phase and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, that's a kind of rough and maybe erratic outline of Love Makes a Way. I guess the only other thing that I'd say is that, where was it? Have I got it? Oh, you know, look, I can talk about this in Q&A. Maybe someone might ask me a question about what were the things that we learned, both failures and successes, but I'll leave that to you if that's interesting. So, and also if you want to ask me about, you know, the sort of theology that undergirded it, you're very welcome to do that too.
Can you put that author in the chat? The analytics, was it the same one that did the analytics as well as that last?
Yeah, so Bill Moyer, not to be confused with Bill Moyers. Bill Moyers, plural, I guess, is the American journalist. Bill Moyer was the thing. But if you search Bill Moyer, I'll put it in the chat as well. that'll yield some stuff.
Yeah, another program that's very helpful is one that was started by the Quakers called the Alternatives to Violence Project, AVP. And a lot of the skills and things that Mary and I have learned over the years have been with the Quakers and doing stuff with AVP, doing nonviolence training in prisons, in schools, in the community, as well as then getting involved in activism, getting arrested and going to court, that type of thing.
Yeah, there were other authors that have been deeply influential for us, like Gene Sharp.
Yes.
Was very influential. And there's a great documentary about his work, actually, that I highly recommend called, this is it, How to Start a Revolution. It's excellent, assuming that's the name. Forgive me if it's off.
So questions or comments?
Could I just comment on one of the sort of spillovers was that looking at the numbers, over the period following Love Makes a Way and then the Sanctuary movement, which flowed out of that actually in an interesting way, was the number of children in offshore detention over that period actually reduced substantially. The government would never say that what that public activity had any impact on it, but it really is, I think, true that created the pressure that it meant that particularly vulnerable group were in fact moved out of the offshore detention. I mean, there were a lot of problems with what happened when they came onshore, but I would think that it was that there actually were some practical impacts arising from the activity, as from my study of it and following of the issues.
Look, certainly we had a pretty clear sense from behind the scenes that we had pushed other organizations, both like really sort of conservative reform-based organizations like the Refugee Council.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, sorry, when I say conservative, that's not me detracting from them in any way. It's a reform sort of policy organization, like really conservative in that kind of regard, doing fantastic work. But I remember meeting with some of their folks, and it sort of had been able to push them into a higher gear. A bunch of the other sort of activist-y type organizations like Refugee Action Coalition, for example, we got quite a bit of airtime with them because it sort of helped them to reformulate how they might do the work. And we had massive disagreements, by the way. Like, I mean, they thought our sort of hope that politicians might have a change of heart, they just thought that was stupid. So whereas that sort of undergirded all of our work, so the offer of reconciliation and healing and all that kind of thing. So, that was there. But yeah, there was we did have that effect, I think, based on the many conversations that I had. But I think that the biggest effect we had was just the church. The effect we had on the church was significant, right? I mean, the church, I've recently written an article about this that details all the kind of history behind this. It's about to come out in Uniting Church Studies in the next couple of months.
Oh, great.
So there's about 6,000 or 7,000 words there of sort of my thoughts on all this. But prior to 2014, there wasn't much happening in the church. The Catholic Church had written some great documents. So had the Uniting Church, like some great submissions to the various parliamentary bodies and things. The Salvation Army were doing some good service delivery work, but it wasn't gonna change the world or anything. So the church was largely dormant on this stuff. And I don't mean to put down anything that was happening as unimportant. Of course it was important. I think one of the most important things that happened throughout this whole period was just the amount of Christians that were housing refugees in their homes. I mean, it's hard to overstate how important that was, right? But in terms of sort of the advocacy side of things, speaking up, the church was largely silent. But now, by the end of 2014, you had some pretty significant shifts there. I mean, for me, one of the big ones was that the Sydney Anglican Synod put forward a pretty significant motion about refugees that they just would not have done without Love Makes a Way. And I know that because one of the sort of the seconders of that, Jeff Broughton, told me as much. So that was one of the big effects we had. Certainly, we didn't ever think that what we were doing on our own could make a difference. The plan was always to sort of push people to do other things. Like the dramatization was always to keep pushing everyone else forward. And that's kind of what you do. You're trying to get people off the fence, even if they fall on the other side of the fence. You want people active because it either gets them active on your side, or if they're active on the other side, if you really think that you're right, they tend to sort of say things and do things that are not helpful to their cause ultimately. And you kind of want to encourage that. The sanctuary movement that Doug talked about, if you know what that is, great. If you don't, I wish I had time to explain it. But that came out of Love Makes a Way pretty directly. Like our folks were the ones who were behind the scenes, starting the conversations about it happening. Peter Catt from Brisbane was a major. He'd been involved with Love Makes a Way, and he was one of the major drivers of that. But Love Makes a Way organisers were behind the scenes, basically lining up churches to say we'll take part in that. And Get Up was involved, but they had no way to do that work, and so they relied on us to basically go. And we told Get Up, like, don't make yourself front and center because you'll scare people off. You'll scare Christians off, right? Just support the work quietly, otherwise it's gonna collapse.
I think one of the things that was good about the way Love Makes a Way proceeded was they didn't do the entire refugee program, but kind of like Gandhi, they chose children, which just caught people. It's that all of these children are, and this is what they're living with. So it hooked in people emotionally, and then they were willing to start to act. And so that choosing a part of what the issue was and then pushing it out from there. Because I know every time I talked about it, that's where it hooked people. Even police, when we were being arrested, talking to them and saying, no, if this was my children or my grandchildren, or, and he was like, don't cry about it. But yeah, so that was important.
Yeah, it was a real way to educate the police, because the police that we met in Malcolm Turnbull's office had never come across people who were willing to commit civil disobedience before. And so it was a real education thing to say, no, this is something that we're willing to be arrested for.
Almost to the point where we thought we should make a brochure to hand out to police about nonviolence.
Yeah.
Along with the chocolate brownies.
Yeah, well, look, that was one of the things that we're almost always able to do, is have good relationships with police, which really helped. As you say, they had no idea what they were dealing with. I think one of the funniest things that happened in all of Love Makes a Way was that time in Turnbull's office when the police had arrived, they'd surrounded the group, and were ready to take you, and you were singing, because I wasn't in the group, I was running media, but you were singing Amazing Grace, and Radhika, who was in the group, she was leading, and she must know about 17 verses of Amazing Grace, because you'd get to the end of a verse and the police would step forward and get ready to sort of grab you, and then you'd start singing again, and they go, oh, no, okay, yep. and this happened about 5 times.
Yeah, and we prayed for the police, which was something that I don't think they had come across before, because they're used to people being aggressive toward them. And we actually took time to pray for them before they arrested us.
So all those dynamics are really interesting. And even look, if all it was an experiment in kind of non-violence, it'd be interesting. But in addition, obviously, all the other things and the campaign as a whole was really excellent. But look, my hope is that the skills that we were able to train people in and give people experience in are skills they still hold and are still available to the church when they're needed. And I hope that we find uses for them, because the church is going to be far more healthy when it's known for risking its skin for the sake of others, rather than constantly whinging on about persecution or some bullshit, you know.
I know I took 2 of my grandchildren to the one in the Parliament House. And so they had to take the training beforehand. And it's interesting the impact that that's had on their lives, because they were both fairly young. They didn't end up staying in the Parliament thing. We went up onto the balcony, but at least they had the training, they saw that. And I think what a good experience.
Yeah.
Now they're young
Yeah.
adults. Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I kind of certainly not regret, because it's not a matter of regret, but I wish my kids had been a bit older, or in the case of the boys, had even been alive when Love Makes a Way was happening, because it would have been great to have them, conscious of that, but not just so they can go, oh, your dad got arrested, but so that they could sort of, they live, my kids live in pretty conservative Baptist church land now. We have discussions around the dinner table about, they're like, talking to me the other day about, telling kids at school about Jesus, because they're not going to heaven. And I went, oh, okay, here we are. Such an interesting place to be. I wish that they'd had that kind of engagement with the different kind of Christian engagement with society. Yeah.
Mhm.